It was here at the Carolco Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina, that actor Brandon Lee was filming The Crow. Ironically, the film is about a man who dies and comes back to life to avenge his death. For decades, the truth stayed buried. Today, Chuck Norris digs it up, and Hollywood's darkest secret is finally exposed. There are tragedies that shake the world, and then there are the truths behind them that no one dares to reveal. For over 30 years, Brandon Lee's death was wrapped in mystery, silence, and rumor. But today, everything changes. At 85, Chuck Norris finally confirms the rumors about Brandon Lee's tragic death. A shot heard across Hollywood. March 31st, 1993, the day Brandon Lee's life was stolen, and the day the rumors Chuck Norris would one day confirm first took root. What should have been another ordinary filming day instead became a permanent scar on Hollywood's history, one that would echo through decades of sorrow, suspicion, and regret. The set of The Crow had been buzzing with a certain electric energy. Brandon Lee, charismatic and intensely talented, was stepping into his own legend. This film was supposed to be his breakthrough, the moment he would emerge not merely as Bruce Lee's son, but as a force of nature all his own. The scene, on paper, was simple. Walk into the room, react to a gun pointed at him, and collapse in a choreographed moment of cinematic death. The gun was loaded with what the crew believed were harmless blanks, a familiar Hollywood magic illusion. But hidden in the chamber was death itself. When the gun fired, Brandon staggered backward, confusion flashing across his face, so authentic that for a heartbeat, the crew thought it was just acting, until he fell, hard and lifeless, onto the set floor. And then, everything changed. Panic erupted. Paramedics rushed him to New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington, North Carolina. For hours, surgeons fought to save him. But at 1:03 p.m., Brandon Lee, just 28 years old, was pronounced dead. The news hit like an earthquake. Hollywood mourned. The world mourned. The tragedy was not the result of a risky stunt or reckless thrill-seeking. No, it was something far more unsettling. A collapse of basic safeguards. A betrayal of trust between the camera, the crew, and the life they were supposed to protect. Whispers quickly grew into roars. How could this happen? Who was responsible? Even now, decades later, the shadow of that moment lingers. A haunting reminder that in Hollywood, dreams are fragile, and sometimes they are destroyed before they ever have a chance to truly live. But not everyone who mourned Brandon's loss did so from the sidelines. In the shadows of Hollywood's tight-lipped elite, one man in particular wrestled with a truth he had carried for decades. A truth he had been too afraid, too loyal, to ever share. That man was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris's silent battle. Long before tragedy would strike the Crow set, Chuck Norris already knew how unforgiving Hollywood's obsession with realism could be. He had already experienced the dire consequences of taking shortcuts on the set, only escaping through sheer luck. His own near-fatal experience, for example, on the set of Missing in Action, left him scarred, not just physically, but with an unshakable knowledge of how easily death could slip through the cracks of a rushed production. And deep down, Chuck Norris carried a fear he couldn't shake. That one day, someone might not be as lucky as he had been. The incident occurred during the tumultuous filming of Missing in Action in the intense heat of the Philippines, a period when action films were renowned for their authenticity. CGI was still years away from transforming Hollywood stunts into safe, bloodless illusions. Back then, danger wasn't a backdrop. It was baked into the very fabric of filmmaking. The shortcuts were common, and risks were seen as badges of honor, not the deadly red flags they truly were. The scene was deceptively simple. Chuck, playing a tough, battle-hardened POW, would sit inside a battered, bullet-riddled truck as enemy fire tore into the vehicle. To simulate this, the effects crew rigged the truck's frame with squibs, tiny explosive charges designed to mimic bullets striking metal. But even before the cameras rolled, an unease gnawed at Norris's instincts. The same instincts that had kept him alive through years of martial arts tournaments, stunt work, and military service. The squibs were mounted unusually close, alarmingly close, to where he would be positioned. He voiced his concerns quietly, diplomatically. Time was money, the crew was behind schedule, and the director needed the shot now, not after another hour of rewiring the setup. Norris, ever the consummate professional, swallowed his apprehension and took his place in the truck. Action was called. A deafening series of pops and flashes erupted around him, and then, disaster. One squib misfired violently, sending a jagged spray of metallic fragments hurtling across the confined space. Norris felt the impact instantly, a searing, blinding pain across his face. Shrapnel tore into the flesh near his left eye and shredded part of his nose. Blood poured down his face, splattering onto the truck's rusted floorboards. For a moment, everything stopped. The crew, the cameras, the noise of the set, all of it suspended in stunned silence as Norris staggered out of the vehicle, clutching his face, his vision swimming. He was rushed to a local hospital where overwhelmed doctors, lacking the precision tools of a major Western medical center, did what they could. Emergency surgery followed. Part of Norris's nasal cartilage had been torn away, and a hastily constructed plastic nose was grafted in place so production could limp forward without replacing their star. He survived, barely. But the wound wasn't just physical. In the years that followed, Chuck rarely spoke about that day. Yet deep inside, a chilling truth took root. In the world of action filmmaking, death was never as far away as the cameras made it seem. It was a constant, invisible companion, always a misfire, a misstep, or a split-second delay away. At the time, Chuck thought he had simply been unlucky, but the years that followed taught him a darker truth. It wasn't luck at all. It was a system built on speed, pressure, and denial, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed someone who wouldn't walk away. That someone was Brandon Lee, the son of his old friend and idol, Bruce Lee. When he heard that Brandon had been killed on set, the old fear Norris had buried deep inside came roaring back to life. This time, someone hadn't survived. The nightmare he had narrowly escaped had finally claimed someone else. The fatal chain reaction. In the chaos that followed Brandon Lee's collapse, the entertainment world scrambled for answers. But the truth was darker than anyone feared. At first, the excuses came fast. It was supposed to be a blank. The gun had been checked. The scene was routine. But as investigators peeled back the layers of that night, a much darker and more insidious truth emerged. The fatal mistake had been set in motion days earlier, for scenes requiring close-up shots of the revolver's loaded cylinder, a detail that audiences would never consciously notice but that filmmakers obsess over. Dummy rounds had been fashioned. These dummy rounds were meant to look real, but were rendered inert, lacking gunpowder. However, during their careless creation, no one properly removed the live primer, the small explosive cap at the base of a bullet that, even without gunpowder, could generate enough force to dislodge a bullet tip into the barrel. And that's exactly what happened. When the dummy round was fired for a camera close-up, the primer's small explosion pushed the bullet head, not out of the barrel, but just far enough into it to become a hidden, deadly trap. No one heard the bullet move. No one saw it lodge itself silently into the barrel, turning a harmless prop into a hidden weapon. No one noticed. Later, the same revolver was reloaded, this time with blanks, cartridges containing gunpowder but no bullet, intended to create flash and smoke for the scene in which Brandon's character would be shot. But blanks, while lacking a projectile, still produce explosive force. And when that force met the lodged bullet tip, it was no longer a blank. It was a fully lethal shot. The gun was handed off casually. Safety protocols that should have been redundant and obsessive were reduced to hurried glances and assumptions. The barrel was never properly checked. The hidden bullet was never cleared. And so, in the split second when the blank fired, the fatal chain reaction was complete. The bullet tore across the set and into Brandon Lee's abdomen, cutting through organs, arteries, and life itself. At first, some thought he was simply acting. So authentic was the look of confusion and pain on his face. But within minutes, the horrifying reality set in. The cameras had captured not a scene, but a catastrophe. It was a mistake measured not in years of negligence, but in a single forgotten detail. A bullet tip barely the size of a fingernail. It cost Brandon Lee his life. It devastated a family already marked by tragedy. And it shattered forever the illusion that movie sets were playgrounds where danger could be perfectly choreographed and controlled. Behind the glamour and the choreography, death had been waiting all along. Quiet, patient, and merciless. The world demanded answers, and at 85, Chuck Norris was finally ready to give them. Chuck Norris breaks the silence. For decades, Chuck Norris carried the burden in silence. He had watched the aftermath of Brandon Lee's death unfold from a painful distance. He saw the public fascination, the sensational headlines, and the ghoulish curiosity that reduced Brandon Lee's death to a piece of Hollywood trivia. He heard the wild theories of assassinations, sabotage, and curses following the Lee family. He saw how the industry, eager to move on, turned the page without ever truly confronting the rot underneath. Chuck said nothing, not because he was indifferent, but because fear and loyalty wrapped around him like chains. Fear of being blacklisted, fear of betraying colleagues and friends, fear of igniting a firestorm that would consume the careers of friends he had fought beside for decades. Lawyers advised silence. Studios whispered that speaking out could destroy careers. Publicists warned that pointing fingers would only cause more pain, and that anyone who did would be seen as a traitor. Chuck wasn't ordered into silence with threats. It was something quieter, more insidious. A handshake, a look, a conversation behind closed doors. Don't stir it up. You'll only make things worse. Let the past stay buried. For years, he buried the truth, telling himself it was safer that way, telling himself it wouldn't change anything, telling himself the system would never listen. But at 85 years old, Chuck Norris finally spoke the words he had buried deep inside. Words that cut deeper than any roundhouse kick he had ever delivered. He said, "They made me hide this." At 85, with time slipping away, Chuck could no longer carry the weight of that hidden truth alone. Chuck Norris, a man who had built a lifetime of discipline around respect for risk, finally spoke with a quiet certainty. Brandon Lee's death was not an unforeseeable accident. It wasn't fate. It wasn't a tragic coincidence. It was a tragedy scripted by human failure, cascade of small shortcuts, ignored warnings, and casual negligence, each one compounding until the cost became lethal. At the center of it all was the weapon. The revolver that fired the fatal shot had been improperly handled from the beginning. It had been used earlier for scenes requiring dummy rounds, cartridges made to look real but inert. Yet when the scene shifted to require blanks, cartridges designed to create a muzzle flash without a projectile, basic protocol demanded a thorough, meticulous check. That inspection, astonishingly, never happened. Not the way it should have. The weapon had been left in an unsecured state between takes, sitting on a prop cart, accessible to anyone, vulnerable to contamination. The set armorer The specialist whose sole duty was to ensure weapon safety was not always present during rehearsals and set changes. Pressed by time constraints and budget pressures, the assistant director, not a weapons expert, took it upon himself to declare the gun cold, meaning safe to use. When the time came to shoot the scene, he handed it to Brandon, trusting procedures that had already begun to rot from within. There were warnings from within the crew. By the time Brandon Lee stepped onto the set that day, the clockwork of disaster had already been wound tight, ticking down to the inevitable. Chuck Norris, after years of silence, could no longer pretend otherwise. He could no longer protect the system that had demanded he look the other way. Brandon wasn't simply lost to bad luck. He was taken by negligence, piece by piece, mistake by mistake, until there was nothing left to save. Chuck's words didn't come with anger. They came with sorrow, and with them came a reckoning. The price of silence had already been paid, with blood. Now, at last, the truth was spoken aloud, and the world, whether it wanted to or not, had to listen. But Brandon Lee's story didn't end with tragedy. His spirit and his dreams refused to be buried. The weight of a legacy. From the moment Brandon Bruce Lee was born, the world had already decided who he was meant to become. The son of Bruce Lee, the icon who redefined martial arts, shattered racial barriers, and died at the height of his fame. Brandon carried an invisible inheritance, heavy and unrelenting. From the outside, it seemed inevitable. Same flashing smile, same lean athleticism, same fire behind the eyes. Many assumed he would pick up the torch his father had dropped too soon. He would finish the journey Bruce Lee had started, but Brandon resisted. He loved his father deeply, idolized him, but he refused to live as a copy. He pursued acting, not to be the next Bruce Lee, but to be Brandon Lee. And so his career took a different path. Less martial arts showcase, more complex, emotionally charged roles. He trained relentlessly in both craft and combat. He studied Shakespeare and method acting with the same discipline he applied to fight choreography. Directors quickly took notice. Brandon wasn't a novelty. He wasn't just a fighter. He was an actor with depth, with soul, with something electric flickering behind his performances that no camera could fully capture. By the early 1990s, his breakout was imminent. Rapid Fire had demonstrated his star potential, charismatic, tough, and nuanced. But it was The Crow that promised to transform him into a household name. A bankable, serious, leading man whose face would grace magazine covers, theater marquees, and the cultural imagination. Behind the rising career, however, lived a quieter, darker anxiety. Brandon was acutely aware of the tragedies that had haunted his family. He knew the strange, chilling superstitions, the whispers that a Lee family curse lurked unseen, a phantom stalking the bloodline. He knew how fragile life could be, how abruptly and cruelly it could end. Publicly, he never spoke of it. He smiled for interviews, laughed off the comparisons, and insisted on looking forward. Privately, close friends say, Brandon sometimes confessed his fears, that he would not live a long life, that fate, whatever it was, might have other plans. But he kept chasing his dream anyway. He kept building a future anyway. He kept fighting to create a life and a legacy that would be his own. When Brandon Lee died on the set of The Crow, the world lost more than just a rising star. It lost a man who had fought every day, quietly and courageously, to forge his own identity, to break free of the towering shadow he had been born under. And for those who knew him, the pain of his loss was magnified by the knowledge that Brandon wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing purpose. He wasn't living in the past. He was trying to create a future that was stolen before he ever had the chance to truly live it. But behind Brandon's death was something even darker. a system that had been quietly gambling with lives for years and losing. Hollywood's hidden truths behind the glittering marquees and box office records, Hollywood's action genre thrived on a secret economy of risk. Throughout the explosive 1980s and 1990s, as audiences demanded ever bigger, bloodier thrills, safety often came second. Budgets soared for actors and effects, but corners were quietly cut where it mattered most: protecting lives. Gun protocols, once sacred, began to erode. Weapons that should have been checked and double-checked were passed casually between overworked assistants. Realistic dummy rounds were sometimes handcrafted without proper safety procedures. Chain of custody rules frayed to the point of invisibility. It was an open secret. Producers, directors, actors, all knew the invisible line they walked. But the show had to go on. And danger, they believed, was just part of the price. The accident that claimed Brandon Lee on the set of The Crow wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the inevitable result of a broken system that had ignored the warning signs for far too long. And beneath the red carpets and golden trophies, beneath the applause and the fame, Hollywood carried its shame. For years, Chuck Norris carried the burden of knowing how close he had come himself. Fear kept him silent. Loyalty kept him obedient. At 85, he finally chose to speak. And when he did, the industry could no longer pretend it hadn't been warned. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Hollywood did what it always did best. It moved on. For those who had seen the warning signs and stayed silent, guilt never truly left. Chuck Norris's personal regret. For decades, Chuck Norris carried a wound no one could see, a scar not etched in flesh, but in memory. He thought of Brandon Lee often, in the quiet hours no camera could capture. He remembered the boy who used to tag along behind Bruce Lee on dusty sets, fascinated by the world his father moved through with grace and command. Chuck remembered the teenager who had grown into a young man, fiercely talented, humble, generous with his laughter. Brandon was not just a name or a headline to Chuck. He was a living soul, brimming with promise. When Brandon died, the shock wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the recognition. His passing was no freak accident. It was the fatal consequence of a system he knew all too well, a system that cut corners, that pushed crews too fast, that treated safety protocols as negotiable when the schedule tightened or the budget thinned. And Chuck, despite all his experience, despite all his instincts, had stayed silent. He told himself for years that speaking out wouldn't change anything, that it would cost him friends, alienate studios, and tarnish reputations, maybe even his own. Hollywood had a long memory for troublemakers, but a short one for whistleblowers. At 85, surveying the long arc of his life and career, Chuck finally admitted what he once could not. Even personal safety meant nothing when weighed against the value of a young man's life. Real honor, Chuck realized, wasn't measured by trophies or fame. It's measured by courage. The courage to defend the vulnerable, even when it costs you everything. So now, he spoke. He spoke not with sensationalism, not with wild theories or blame, but with sorrow, with a clarity sharpened by the decades of regret. He spoke because Brandon Lee deserved that much, and so did everyone who trusted that movie sets were supposed to be safe. The price of silence had already been paid, with blood. Now, with the truth finally spoken, perhaps healing could finally begin. Thank you for remembering Brandon Lee's story with us. If this moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video with us, and catch you in the next one.